Moscow. A Tuesday evening in July 1985. A man in his mid-40s stands on a street corner near the Kutuzovsky Prospect, holding a green plastic Safeway bag from a shop that does not exist anywhere in the Soviet Union, eating quietly, looking at nothing in particular. To anyone passing, he is simply a Muscovite killing a few minutes on his way home. He is, in fact, a colonel of the KGB, and for 11 years he has been one of the most valuable secret agents Britain has ever run. Weeks earlier, he sat in a KGB interrogation room and lied, without flinching, to trained men whose entire job was to make him confess. He does not know for certain whether he succeeded. He does not know if he is being watched right now from a parked car or a window across the street. And he does not know if anyone from British intelligence will even see the bag in his hand, because this is the signal, the single piece of tradecraft standing between him and a bullet in a Lubyanka basement, and he has no way of knowing whether, after everything, it will actually work. How does a man arrive at this corner? How does a KGB officer, born into the Soviet security apparatus, trained inside it, trusted with its deepest secrets, end up gambling his life on whether a stranger notices a shopping bag? His name is Oleg Gordievsky. By the summer of 1985, he had spent more than a decade secretly serving Britain's secret intelligence service, MI6, rising all the while inside Soviet foreign intelligence until he stood on the verge of becoming the KGB's own resident in London, its top officer in one of the most sensitive postings on Earth. Along the way, he had handed the West something more valuable than any single document. In the autumn of 1983, at the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, he told his handlers a truth almost no one in Washington or London wanted to believe. The frightened, aging men running the Kremlin were not bluffing. They genuinely believed the West might be preparing a nuclear first strike, and a routine NATO exercise had just brought the world dangerously close to a war neither side intended. That single piece of intelligence helped talk two nuclear superpowers back from a ledge neither fully understood it was standing on. Now he stood on a different ledge, a street corner, a shopping bag, and a plan built years earlier for exactly this nightmare, waiting to learn whether it would save his life or whether he had simply run out of time. Gordievsky was born in Moscow on the 10th of October 1938, into a family that belonged, body and soul, to the Soviet security state. His father had served in the secret police through the darkest years of Stalin's purges. His older brother was already a serving KGB officer by the time Oleg came of age. There was no rebellion in the boy, no youthful defiance of the family trade. He was, if anything, its natural continuation, a gifted linguist who studied at the elite Moscow State Institute of International Relations, the finishing school for the Soviet Union's diplomats and spies. He joined the KGB in 1962, trained for its Foreign Intelligence Directorate, and within a year found himself posted to East Berlin, where in August 1961 he had watched, a young officer barely out of training, East German workers lay the first courses of concrete and barbed wire that would become the Berlin Wall. It was his first close look at what the system he served was actually willing to do to keep its own people penned in. It was not, however, the moment that broke him. That would come later, and from farther away. His first foreign posting proper, in 1966, took him to Copenhagen under diplomatic cover, and Denmark did something to Gordievsky that Moscow had not planned for. He fell in love with the West, not with its politics at first, but with its textures, its jazz clubs, its unrationed bookshops, its ballet, its choral music, its plain, unpoliced ordinariness. In private, he became something close to an Anglophile before he had ever set foot in England, devouring English poetry, teaching himself the baffling, leisurely rules of cricket, the sort of quiet, unofficial affection a Soviet officer was never supposed to feel for the other side. He went home in 1970 and was posted back to Copenhagen again in 1972 for a second tour. And it was during this second posting that everything changed, because of something that had happened 4 years earlier, not in Denmark at all, but in Czechoslovakia. In August 1968, Soviet tanks had rolled into Prague to crush a government that had tried, briefly, to build socialism with what its own leaders called a human face. Gordievsky, watching from his post abroad, was horrified, not as a Western sympathizer performing outrage, but as a Soviet officer watching his own state extinguish, by force, a small hope he had quietly shared. It was the same machine that had walled off Berlin, now crushing a country instead of merely dividing one. Something in him set, quietly and permanently, against the system that had made him. He told no one. He kept working. And in Copenhagen, without knowing it yet, he had already come to the attention of people watching very closely indeed. The Danish Security Service, PET, had flagged Gordievsky early as a KGB officer of unusual interest, disciplined, cultured, evidently uneasy in ways that showed in small signs to those trained to look for them. They shared their assessment with the British. Officers from MI6 began a long, deliberately unhurried courtship, the kind that cannot be rushed without breaking the man being courted. There was no dramatic pitch, no envelope of cash slid across a restaurant table. Recruitment of a source this valuable, this exposed, does not work that way. It works through patience, shared meals, shared books, careful conversation that edges, over months and then years, toward a question that can never quite be asked outright until the answer is already certain. Long before Gordievsky ever agreed to anything, his future handlers were already teaching him, in small, unspoken increments, how to live the divided life he would need for the next decade, how to spot a tail without appearing to look, how to hold a conversation with two audiences in mind, how to feel, at every moment, the low hum of danger that never quite reaches the surface of an ordinary face. By around 1974, the courtship had become something else entirely. Gordievsky was formally in place as a secret source for British intelligence, a serving KGB officer who had chosen, on conviction alone, to work against the system that had raised him. He would be run for the next 11 years under an arrangement inside the British government so sensitive it eventually carried its own internal code name, Nocton, known only to the smallest circle of officials who needed to know that a Soviet colonel was, in effect, working for them from the inside. He was not paid to betray his country. He was not blackmailed into it. He did it because he had watched what the Soviet system did to Prague, and he could not go on serving it in silence. That distinction, belief over bribery, is what made him so hard for his own service to ever suspect, and so dangerous to them once suspicion finally arrived. For now, suspicion was still years away. Gordievsky returned to Moscow and worked inside KGB headquarters itself, in the Scandinavian department, and continued passing material to his handlers through the slow, nerve-shredding tradecraft of Moscow rules, the strict, almost ritual discipline built for running a source inside the one city on Earth where a single mistake meant no trial, only abasement. There were no meetings in cafes, no envelopes handed over lunch. There were chalk marks left on a particular lamppost to signal that a message was waiting. There were brief, brush-past encounters on a crowded pavement that lasted less than 2 seconds and left nothing behind but a folded scrap of paper, transferred hand to hand. There were dead drops in parks and stairwells, checked only after exhaustive hours-long routes designed to draw out and exhaust any surveillance before a KGB officer would dare go near a hiding place built to betray the KGB itself. Every contact carried the same silent arithmetic. One mistake, and there would be no appeal, no lawyer, no headline. There would simply be a man who stopped coming home. And then, in 1982, Britain got something it could barely have hoped for. Gordievsky was posted to London. He arrived under diplomatic cover, working the KGB's political intelligence line inside the London Residentura, the Soviet spy station housed within the embassy compound, a world of its own, watched from the outside by British counter-surveillance and watched from within by officers who did not entirely trust each other either. Gordievsky's own days took on a strange, doubled rhythm. By morning, he drafted political assessments for Moscow, attended diplomatic receptions, cultivated British contacts for recruitment exactly as a real KGB officer should. By night, in meetings arranged with elaborate, invisible care, a change of coat here, a detour through a department store there, a rendezvous confirmed only through a signal left days in advance, he sat with his British case officers and told them everything his own service had shown him that day. He was, in every outward sense, a rising Soviet diplomat with a talent for languages and an easy manner at parties. He was, in every sense that mattered, already working for the other side. The resident, the KGB's station chief in London, was a blunt, old-school officer named Arkady Guk, a man whose caution sometimes tipped into paranoia and whose instincts, in one extraordinary episode, would prove catastrophically wrong. In 1983, a British counterintelligence officer named Michael Bettany, working inside MI6 itself, attempted to volunteer secret material to the KGB Residentura in London. Anonymous letters, offers of documents, a genuine British officer trying to defect in place. Arkady Guk, convinced it was a trap laid by his British enemies, dismissed the approach and let it die on his desk, never even reporting it properly to Moscow. Gordievsky did tell London, passing the approach to his own handlers, who alerted MI5, who identified and arrested Bettany, later convicted and imprisoned for espionage. It was a quiet, perfect irony. The KGB's own secret man in London had just helped catch a British traitor that the KGB's own resident had thrown away without even recognizing what he held. Guk's judgment would cost him more than that one missed opportunity. British counterintelligence, fed in part by what Gordievsky himself was quietly reporting, closed in on Guk's own activities, and in 1985 he was declared persona non grata and expelled from Britain as an undeclared intelligence officer. That expulsion did something extraordinary. It left Gordievsky, the Soviet colonel secretly working for MI6, positioned to become the KGB's resident designate in London, the presumptive head of Soviet intelligence operations in Britain. It was the post the entire Western alliance would have paid almost anything to control from the inside. And for a brief, remarkable window, it very nearly did. But before any of that unfolded, in the cold winter of 1983, Gordievsky had already delivered the single most consequential piece of intelligence of his entire career. A warning that the world stood closer to nuclear war than almost anyone in the West understood, and that the Soviet leadership genuinely, terrifyingly, believed it too. By the early 1980s, the atmosphere inside the Kremlin had curdled into something close to paranoia. Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chairman who became Soviet leader in November 1982, presided over a leadership that had watched President Reagan brand their country an evil empire, watched NATO decide to station new Pershing II and cruise missiles across Western Europe capable of striking Soviet territory within minutes, and concluded, with real and mounting dread, that the West might be preparing a surprise nuclear first strike. In 1981, Andropov's KGB had launched a sprawling global intelligence program with the codename Operation Ryan, an acronym for the Russian words for nuclear missile attack, instructing officers at stations around the world to watch obsessively for any sign that a Western government was quietly preparing for war. Officers were sent bizarre, deadly serious checklists. Report unusual troop movements. Report lit windows late at night in defense ministries. Report any spike in blood bank donations, any sudden slaughter of cattle for war rations, anything at all that might betray a hidden countdown. From the outside, it can sound almost absurd. From inside the Kremlin in those years, it was treated as a matter of survival. Gordievsky, sitting inside the London Residentura, watched the frantic Ryan traffic arrive from Moscow and understood something the West did not yet grasp. This was not propaganda staged for internal consumption. The fear was real, and it reached all the way to the top. Then, in November 1983, NATO ran a command post exercise called Able Archer 83, a simulated escalation through conventional war into a coordinated nuclear release, using unusually realistic new communication procedures and involving, for the first time, senior political figures playing out their roles alongside the military commanders. It was meant purely as a rehearsal. To a Soviet leadership already primed by 2 years of Operation Ryan to look for exactly this pattern, it looked disturbingly like cover for the real thing. Soviet nuclear forces in Eastern Europe were quietly moved to a heightened stage of readiness. Nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland were armed and placed on alert. For a matter of days, without either side fully realizing it, the world stood closer to a nuclear miscalculation than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis 2 decades earlier. It was Gordievsky, inside London, who told MI6 the true shape of what was happening in Moscow, that this was not theater staged for Western eyes, but genuine structural fear at the very top of the Soviet state, the product of years of a leadership that had convinced itself the missiles might already be on their way. That warning moved fast and quiet through the Nocton channel, drafted and redrafted, weighed by British analysts against everything else they knew, and carried up to the desk of Margaret Thatcher herself. Through the intelligence-sharing arrangement between London and Washington, it reached the American side as well, feeding into an assessment that would shape how the Reagan administration itself came to understand just how dangerous the standoff had actually become. Reagan, by his own later account, was shaken by how close the two superpowers had drifted toward a war born of mutual misreading rather than actual intention. In the years that followed, his public rhetoric noticeably softened. Arms-controlled talks that had stalled found new life, and both capitals worked harder to ensure that neither side would ever again mistake a rehearsal for an attack. One man, watching cable traffic inside a KGB station in London, had helped stop a war that neither side truly wanted, and both sides were sleepwalking toward. And in December 1984, less than a year after the war scare, his usefulness reached even higher, into a single meeting that would help define the last decade of the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev, then still a rising figure in the Soviet Politburo and not yet its general secretary, was preparing to visit Britain for the first time. No one in London knew quite what to make of him, whether he represented a genuine break from the gray, dying men who had run the Kremlin through Gordievsky's entire career, or simply a smoother face on the same machine. Gordievsky, who had studied Gorbachev's career and character from inside Soviet intelligence itself, helped brief the assessment that reached Margaret Thatcher before the two ever sat down together, a portrait of an unusually confident, unusually curious Soviet leader, different in temperament from anyone who had held real power in Moscow in decades. Thatcher met Gorbachev at Chequers, and came away persuaded enough to tell the world, in a phrase that would outlive the Cold War itself, that this was a man she could do business with. A KGB colonel secretly reporting to MI6 had just helped shape the judgment of a British Prime Minister meeting the man who would, within a few short years, help bring the Soviet Union itself to an end. He did not know it yet, but on the other side of the Atlantic, in the spring of 1985, a single conversation in Washington was about to undo everything. In April 1985, a CIA officer named Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington and volunteered to sell secrets to the KGB. His motives, as it later emerged, were almost banal beside the scale of the damage they caused: mounting personal debts, a taste for a life he could not otherwise afford. Over the following months and years, Ames would betray the identities of dozens of Western intelligence sources inside the Soviet bloc, men and women who had risked everything to work against Moscow. Many of them would be arrested within months of each other, in a wave so sudden and so devastating that officers on both sides would later call it the Year of the Spy. Most of the agents Ames named would be executed. Among the names he handed over, sooner or later, was Gordievsky's. Gordievsky did not know, in the spring of 1985, exactly why the ground beneath him had begun to shift. He only knew that it had. In May 1985, he was summoned back to Moscow, nothing dramatic in the wording, a routine recall, the kind of thing that happens to KGB officers on foreign postings every year, sometimes even a prelude to promotion. He flew home, and almost immediately, small details told him the truth before anyone said a single word. Things in his Moscow flat had been moved, subtly, in ways only he would notice. A mark he had deliberately left disturbed, proof that someone had searched the place with professional care and assumed no one would ever detect it. He was taken not to an office, but to a KGB dacha outside the city, and there, over hours that blurred together, he was questioned by senior counterintelligence officers who plied him with drink he was almost certain was more than drink, some chemical aid, meant to loosen a tongue that would not loosen on its own. He gave them nothing. He held his nerve through an interrogation built for the express purpose of breaking that nerve, drawing on years of professional training, and by his own account afterward, on something closer to sheer disbelief at his own performance, treating every question as a puzzle to be diffused rather than a threat to be survived, because the moment he let himself feel the danger, his voice would betray him even if his words did not. He admitted no wrongdoing. He signed no confession. He offered no name. And in the strange, brutal calculus of Soviet counterintelligence, that was almost enough. His interrogators were certain. They could not yet prove it. So instead of an arrest, instead of the cell and the bullet that a confirmed traitor could expect, Gordievsky was released, stripped of his post, forbidden to travel abroad again, watched, followed, effectively entombed inside Moscow, his career and his usefulness to the KGB finished, while the investigation into him quietly, patiently continued around him. He was alive. He was free, in the loosest possible sense of the word. Every morning he left his flat and counted the same faces on the same street corners, the same parked cars that had not been there the week before he flew to Moscow, and understood, with total clarity, that it was only a matter of time before the KGB found the proof it did not yet have, and that when it did, there would be no second interrogation. There would only be an ending. Years earlier, in the calm, unhurried days before any of this, Gordievsky and his British handlers had built a contingency for exactly this nightmare, an emergency exfiltration plan, held in reserve, hoped never to be needed, carrying the code name Operation Pimlico. It had been designed and rehearsed, in outline, almost as a matter of routine insurance for a source as deep and as valuable as Gordievsky, the kind of plan a good service builds for its best people and prays it never has to use. It rested on a simple, almost old-fashioned piece of tradecraft, a signal. If Gordievsky ever believed his life was in immediate danger, he was to make his way, at a specific time, on a specific day of the week, to a specific street corner in Moscow, and stand there holding a shopping bag from a Western grocery chain, a small, deliberately mundane object that would mean nothing to any casual observer, and everything to the one man trained to look for it. A prearranged answering gesture, a chocolate bar unwrapped and eaten by a passerby, nothing more, would tell him that London had understood and that the machinery of Pimlico had begun to turn. Now, under KGB surveillance, his passport confiscated, his movements watched, Gordievsky had to find a way to reach that corner without his watchers noticing, and to trust that, on the other end, someone from British intelligence was still checking, week after week, for a signal that might never come. He did it on a run, slipping his surveillance for the length of a jog through Moscow's streets, the kind of ordinary exercise a watched man is still permitted, because refusing it outright would look far more suspicious than taking it. Gordievsky broke from his usual route long enough to reach the designated corner at the designated hour, carrying a green Safeway bag, eating quietly, praying that somewhere nearby an officer from the British embassy was walking past at exactly the right moment, looking for exactly this. He had no way of knowing if it had worked. He simply had to walk away afterward and wait, not knowing whether the message had been seen, not knowing whether his own service was one step behind him, not knowing whether the plan built years ago to save his life was about to save it, or whether he had just spent his last free gamble for nothing. It worked. An MI6 officer walking near the corner recognized the signal for exactly what it was, and answered it, unwrapping and eating a chocolate bar in full view, an ordinary, unremarkable gesture that told Gordievsky, without a single word passing between them, that London had heard him. Operation Pimlico was now live. And the hardest part remained, getting a watched, suspected KGB colonel physically out of the Soviet Union, past its most sensitive land border, without the machinery that had raised him ever finding out. The plan that followed was audacious in its sheer ordinariness. British diplomats stationed in Moscow, officers and their families, using the cover of an entirely unremarkable weekend excursion toward the Finnish frontier, drove north out of the city, wives and small children along for the appearance of nothing more than a family outing. Gordievsky made his own way separately toward the rendezvous point, shedding what surveillance he could and trusting the rest to timing and nerve, changing trains, doubling back through crowds, watching every face twice for the one that might be watching him back. When the moment came, hundreds of miles from Moscow, he was concealed in the boot of one of the diplomatic cars, given something to keep him still and silent for the hours ahead, folded into a space built for luggage, for a border crossing that could take an agonizing stretch of time, with Soviet guards and trained sniffer dogs waiting at the checkpoint just ahead. The dogs were the real danger. Trained to detect human scent sealed inside a vehicle, they had ended smuggling attempts far less desperate than this one. The wives in the cars had come prepared with the ordinary, sour clutter of a real family on a real road trip. Nappies, crisps, the small human mess that clings to any car with young children in it, deployed deliberately around the boot to blur and confound a nose trained for exactly the wrong kind of clean, still air. It was tradecraft built as much from nappies and snack food as from anything taught in a training manual, and it would either work in the next few minutes or it would not. The cars rolled forward, one at a time, toward the checkpoint lights at the Soviet-Finnish frontier. Soviet border guards moved along the vehicles with their dogs. Gordievsky lay folded in the dark of the boot, unable to see anything, able only to hear engines idling, boots on gravel, a dog's breathing somewhere close to the metal above his head, and to wait for the sound of the barrier lifting, or the sound of a door being ordered open. The barrier lifted. The car rolled through, out of the Soviet Union and into Finland, carrying a KGB colonel who had spent 11 years betraying the service that made him, and who had just crossed, hidden in a diplomat's boot, the one border he had never expected to survive. He was flown on to Britain and granted asylum, the most senior KGB officer ever to defect to the West, with his network still for a time entirely intact. A Soviet court sentenced him to death in absentia for treason, a sentence never carried out. His wife and 2 young daughters, left behind in Moscow and told nothing of the plan for their own protection, were held in the Soviet Union for years afterward, before diplomatic pressure finally secured their release to join him in Britain. He spent the rest of his life in England, wrote of what he had seen and done, and was quietly honored by the country that had smuggled him across a border in the boot of a car. He died in 2025, in the country that had saved him.